Nobody should die that way.
I've never seen anything that horrific.
One of the duties of a pathologist is to determine the cause of death.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required. Download Veely now.
In 1958, the town of Macon, Georgia, changed forever when voluptuous, voodoo-loving restaurateur Anjette Lyles stood trial for murder.
Well, in this sleepy little southern town, you find out you got a murderous demon, somebody that could do this kind of thing.
One of 3 children of William and Jetta Donovan, Anjette was their only daughter.
Her maiden name was Donovan, and the Donovan family was generally well thought of. They were good people.
Anjette moved out of the family home in October 1947, when she married Second World War veteran Ben Lyles. A few weeks after setting up home in an apartment on Poplar Street, their first baby, Marcia, was born.
She gained a family, a complete family, because with Ben, his mother also came along as part of the deal. She had originally run, I believe, the restaurant where Ann eventually took over.
The restaurant was Lyles. Operated by Ben's widowed mother, Julia, but technically owned by Ben, the establishment was a local institution.
It was a popular lunch place for the professionals in town. It was just kind of a gathering place for everybody that worked downtown.
When Ben was left in charge of running Lyles after his mother was convalescing from surgery, the business nearly ground to a halt. Ben was an alcoholic. When he returned home late one night, it was clear he was not in a fit state to work, let alone manage the place. So Anjette wrapped up baby Marcia, scuttled down the street, and opened up.
She's fallen in love with the process of running and managing a restaurant, making friends with the general public.
In May 1951, Anjette and Ben welcomed the arrival of their second daughter, Carla. In the space of a couple of months, Ben crashed the family car and sold the family restaurant of 30 years for a paltry $2,500. Anjette was incensed.
This is essentially her identity now. And now the business is going to be sold. The ability to bring in income into the family is going to be greatly diminished, and therefore she's going to be diminished.
Angered by his actions and resentful of their diminishing resources, Anjette's solution was merciless. And her weapon, crippling.
She used taro ant poison. Ant poison that you could buy at the hardware store, readily available to buy. She would have had to have done some research to know about arsenic poisoning.
In and of itself, arsenic is odorless, it's tasteless. It seems, on the surface, very, very benign when you see it. And what made it an effective ant killer was the fact that they would take the substance of arsenic and combine it with sugar water. So it's not going to be an unpleasant taste. It's not going to have a metallic taste to it. It's just going to be sweet.
The cunning, premeditated, well-planned, calculated evil of hers. You give a small dose of arsenic over a period of time, it will attack the weakest organ in your body, whatever that may be, and it affects everybody differently.
Ben's health took a disconcerting turn. He suddenly had chronic nosebleeds.
What's going on with his system is that literally his venous system is beginning to shut down. Think about how easy it is to get a bloody nose. As these vessels begin to collapse as a result of these cellular changes, blood will begin to leach out. So he would have chronic nosebleeds.
On January the 23rd, 1952, his condition violently deteriorated. He was admitted to Macon Hospital.
His extremities were swollen. The feet, the hands, even his arms, very tense to the touch. Many times you'll see this. This is an indication that Ben's lymphatic system had shut down, and also his renal system was shut down. So those systems that are tasked with processing waste in the body essentially are being shut down. So all of the stuff that's contained in the body that in and of itself is toxic is being retained within him. So he can't process urine, his lymph system can't do what it's supposed to do, and it's going to begin to swell.
2 days later, on January the 25th, Ben Lyles was dead. The official cause was encephalitis.
Ben's death would have been absolutely horrific. I don't know that there's any scale that we could actually measure it by in human pain and suffering. Horrible gastrointestinal pains. I would imagine for Ben, it seems like it really impacted his neurological system. I can only imagine the pounding headaches that he had. Horrible, horrible way to die.
By the time she was 26 years old, Anjette had chosen to be a widow, but an impoverished one. To save money, she moved back in with her parents, who had since downsized to a bungalow on Vineville Avenue. Her lonely mother-in-law, Julia, was a frequent visitor. The three adoring grandparents ensured toddler Marcia and baby Carla were always cared for when Anjette went to work. 3 years later, Anjette, with the help of a $12,000 bank loan, bought back the same restaurant Ben had sold. On April 4th, 1955, it opened and was renamed Anjette's.
She's running this restaurant in downtown Macon, about a half a block from the courthouse. Anjette had sort of a big personality, and people like to go there and interact with her. It's kind of a social thing to do, to go to Anjette's restaurant. And it was very popular, and so she was pretty well known in the community.
Among the customers were airline pilots and a future husband for Anjette.
Macon was kind of a hub. The airport was a regular landing spot for major airlines. Anjette actually met Buddy. He was a pilot for one of the airlines, and he would come by on his stopover, and he would have lunch at Anjette's diner.
26-year-old Texan Buddy was born Joe Neil Gabbert, and he was smitten.
Buddy was taken under the spell of Anjette. Buddy apparently had stated to Ann, I'm going to marry you, and that's early on.
After less than a few months of dating, they surprised their families and friends when they became husband and wife on June 24th, 1955. 4 months later, Buddy was due to have minor surgery on an injured wrist, but it would end up being an appointment with arsenic. With an eye on his life insurance, Anjette was plotting Buddy's demise. On November 3rd, Buddy entered hospital for the routine procedure and was kept in overnight. Anjette visited and spiked his fluids with ant poison. The next morning, an aggressive rash had plagued Buddy's body.
His bed and the sheets would be soaked with blood that was issuing forth from his body. With exposure to certain toxins, this will actually begin to present at a cellular level of the skin, where it's a reaction by our system, our autoimmune system, to thwart these manifestations of toxicity in our body. But over a period of time, it got so bad at one point in time that when Buddy was being treated, he asked the nurses to actually tie his hands to the bedpost so he wouldn't scratch himself anymore.
People will die different ways according to the way the arsenic attacks their body. And she had to know that this was, for what she wanted to do, an effective way to do it. And indeed, it was all too effective. I mean, it was readily available. She knew what to do with it.
On November 13th, 1955, after 10 days in hospital, doctors sent him home to continue his recovery.
They might look at him to begin with and think that, well, he's ingested some kind of food that didn't agree with him.
But within days, Buddy became nauseous and dehydrated. Anjette was lacing juice and cola with arsenic.
Can you imagine how frustrating this would be to a practitioner? You're standing over this patient who is screaming out in mortal pain. They're convulsing, and there's nothing that you can do in order to relieve it, particularly if you're not fully aware of what's killing this individual, and the patient is literally dying before their eyes.
Less than a month later, Buddy Gabbert was dead.
The community, their hearts are just going out to this poor woman who's now twice widowed. She's got 2 small children. She's having to support her mother-in-law from a previous marriage.
Daughters Marcia and Carla adapted to life without a father figure.
The kids often come to the restaurant and play among the tables and the chairs, and the staff all knew the little girls. And the mother-in-law had been there for years and years. Even after the transition had taken place, this was the life that the mother-in-law had known. So she would even be there in the afternoon. So she would tend to these children while Anjette ran the restaurant.
But 18 months after losing their stepfather, the 2 little girls would be caring for their grandmother, Julia, who was the next to become distressingly ill. Julia was admitted to Parkview Hospital, with Anjette apparently tending to her.
This kind of made her to be saintly, I guess. Look at her. She's taking care of these people she loves so much. That makes us defenseless at the end. And that allows her to get closer and closer to these individuals. Day after day, she's plying them with this highly, highly toxic substance.
Before leaving work for the hospital, kitchen staff noticed Anjette's peculiar preparations.
They saw Anjette prepare buttermilk that she was taking to her mother-in-law that had the arsenic in it.
On September 29th, 1957, Anjette had claimed Julia's life as well.
There was really no suspicion of any foul play. It was just poor old Anjette, losing, family members, and that can happen in the absence of any misconduct.
But then, 9-year-old Marcia became sick.
Well, she came to hate her daughter because there was some evidence she would look at Marcia and she looked too much like her father, Anjette's first husband, Ben, first one that she murdered. And she would be very abusive towards Marcia, even before she started poisoning her. It was a tragic situation.
She's got a non-productive cough, which is an indication that she's having respiratory difficulty early on. She's also presenting with this kind of non-specific fever. She's not producing any kind of sweating or anything like this. It's a dry fever, if you will. So to touch her forehead, she would feel like she had a fever, possibly even not just hot, but warm to the touch. You can imagine how uncomfortable this is. And again, this goes to this idea that the brain itself is beginning to shut down. And so with that, her body temperature can't be regulated as it normally would.
Marcia was transferred to the increasingly familiar Parkview Hospital. But Anjette was predicting Marcia's demise to her shocked restaurant staff.
In many of these cases, The people that were in the hospital never even ate hospital food, for instance. Anjette would bring the food from the restaurant.
The black ladies that cooked, or the cooks at the restaurant, they knew something was going on. Marcia got sick, was in the hospital, and they knew what was happening. That is, that Anjette was poisoning her daughter, Marcia, by taking lemonade from the restaurant that she would then put the poison in and take it to the hospital, in that fashion administer the small doses of arsenic poisoning.
She's beginning to manifest again with hallucinations. She's even alluded to the fact that she feels as though that bugs are crawling on her. This is a child that has not previously presented with any kind of psychiatric problems whatsoever, no hallucinations, this sort of thing. Just all of a sudden, this begins to present. Now you've also got physical changes that are occurring. Her limbs are beginning to swell. Again, the lymphatic system is shutting down.
Even in the hospital, as she's already become ill, watching her daughter go through hallucinations and great pain, she continued to give her daughter poison.
The housekeeper, Carmen, happened upon a bottle of what's called taro ant killer. She's thinking, I wonder what in the world she's using this for.
Staff at home and at the restaurant were the first to make sense of what their employer was doing to her own family.
The housekeeper, the maid, the cooks at the restaurant were like family. I mean, they knew Marcia and Carla well from in the home and then at the restaurant.
But the racial segregation laws that pervaded the state of Georgia in the 1950s were protecting a serial killer.
I can only imagine it had to be very hard for them not to have wanted to do something sooner, go to the sheriff. And the norms of the culture were, if you do that, bad things could happen to you.
Despite the risks, they sent anonymous messages to the coroner and family members in nearby Cochran.
They saw what was happening and tried to speak up, and they took it upon themselves to write a letter to family members in Cochran, Georgia, that said, "Come quick, Marcia needs help." They did raise the red flag by the anonymous letter to family who responded and alerted the authorities in Bibb County.
By the time Marcia's family received the letter and alerted the Bibb County Sheriff, doctors had begun to suspect Anjette's daughter had been poisoned. But Marcia was now struggling for every breath. On the 5th of April 1958, 3 months shy of her 10th birthday, she passed away.
We're talking about a 9-year-old. A 9-year-old, perfectly healthy girl that went to school, interacted with people. She would come to the restaurant almost daily and interact with the staff. People saw her running about in there. How in the world does she just suddenly succumb? How in the world does she just suddenly die?
It was a question on everyone's mind. Tissue samples of Marcia's, sent for testing, confirmed the suspicion of arsenic poisoning. Police obtained a search warrant for Anjette's house, where they found ant poison and voodoo paraphernalia.
Anjette was into voodoo and had black candles and a sock that supposedly she'd put a picture of someone in, some kind of curse or something, and had all these potions and things that they found in her house. It was part of what attracted so much attention to the case, that this woman, pretty well known in our community, was practicing voodoo in her home out there in Northwoods.
On Tuesday, the 6th of May, Anjette Lyles was arrested on 4 counts of murder.
You can only imagine the horror of Carla felt when her sister died, the death that she died, and shortly thereafter her mother was arrested for that murder, and then the investigation quickly reveals that she had also murdered Carla's father, a stepfather, her grandmother, and then her sister. It's hard to imagine what she went through.
Following the exhumation of Anjette's husbands, it turned out that they had been exposed to arsenic as well, which leads them to believe that she had been doing this for some time. Let's keep in mind her count was 4 people that she had in her immediate circle, that she could ply them with this poison day after day after day with the food she had prepared for them.
This case had a huge impact on our community. I've talked to people over the years that had a child that was a friend of the Lyles daughters, Marcia and Carla, that ate at the restaurant. I mean, afterwards everybody was wondering, has she tried to poison me too? There was a lot of fear in the community that she had maybe tried to poison other people.
William West was the Bibb County Solicitor General.
As it turned out, Mr. West had a conflict by a distant relationship to Anjette that caused him to disqualify himself and turn the matter over to the Attorney General of the state, who then appointed my father, Charles Adams, and Hank O'Neill, who had also been a prosecutor, to be special prosecutors in the case of the state versus Anjette Lyles. For my father and Mr. O'Neill, his law partner, I mean, it was a huge case.
Bill Adams' father Charles and Hank set to work gathering evidence against Anjette. On Monday, October the 6th, 1958, 32-year-old Anjette Lyles was called to trial.
One of the obvious questions is why? Why would this woman murder 4 members of her family? And what they came up with was money, life insurance proceeds, and I think Anjette had gotten close to $50,000 in life insurance proceeds as a result of the deaths of her family members. And the investigation, and later then the prosecution, was able to present examples of Anjette forging signatures on documents. They presented 51 witnesses to the jury. The cooks that saw her preparing the lemonade in buttermilk that had the arsenic in it. And so Anjette was a little careless at times. She ordered the coffin for her daughter before her daughter died.
The prosecutors even found insurance documents and bank statements establishing a motive for the murders.
This is what drove Anjette to murder her family members, essentially. Her first husband, her second husband, her mother-in-law, and her daughter. She took their lives over money.
Well, that woman is crazy, right? I mean, she must be insane. And yet the insanity defense was really not raised at trial. And from a prosecution standpoint, that just invites this insanity angle. And as far as they were concerned, Anjette was not insane, she was just evil.
The prosecution sought the death penalty. On Monday, October 13th, the courtroom awaited the jury's verdict.
I think the jury was only out about an hour and a half. The jury found the way they did, she was subject to the death penalty, and in fact, the death penalty was imposed by the trial judge and set a date for Anjette to be executed, put to death by electrocution. And Georgia had never executed a white woman.
After a failed appeal, Anjette's fate looked sealed, but there was one last avenue.
The defense lawyers asked the governor to appoint a sanity commission, who then examined Anjette, examined the records, and concluded that she was, quote, insane. With that finding by the psychiatrist, the governor then signed an executive order that did not commute Anjette's death sentence, but basically puts it on hold that as long as she is considered insane, she cannot be executed under Georgia law. My dad and Mr. O'Neill, the two special prosecutors, they were very upset about that.
Anjette Lyles avoided the electric chair, but was dispatched to the Central State Hospital in Milledgeville.
There was a women's facility there, but there was also the facility that was set aside for the criminally insane.
She never was found to be sane and served out her sentence at the Central State Hospital, the mental hospital, and was there until she died in somewhere in the 1970s.
While the crimes of Anjette Lyles haunted the community of Macon, no one was more affected than her surviving daughter, Carla.
I don't know where she went other than she did everything she could do, I'm sure with the family's help, to get as far away from this town and this sad story as she could.
You could tell just by looking at his body that he died an extremely painful death.
Just imagine, if you will, that you are literally drowning, that you're strangulated for air.
On the night of October 5th, 1986, 44-year-old Stephen James Litgarn was pronounced dead at his Cheatham County home in Tennessee. Litgarn's brother-in-law, John Stewart Cox, then 31, was rushed unconscious to Baptist Hospital. He died of respiratory failure on October the 8th, never having regained consciousness.
He fought for several hours, but his organs shut down, as well as there was no brain activity, so we knew he was going to be the second victim.
Both men had ingested cyanide. They had suffocated from the inside out.
Cyanide poisoning attacks specifically the respiratory system. It goes immediately into the system and begins to compromise the lungs' ability to process oxygen. Even our cells require oxygen. Imagine the brain, the heart, the lungs, these sorts of things that require an uptake of oxygen constantly to function appropriately. But this interferes with the cell's ability to process oxygen. So it's highly toxic, highly lethal, and it happens in very short order.
Litgarn and Cox had both fallen ill at a family gathering.
I was contacted by Sheriff Doris Weekly that a death had occurred and that there was another serious injury involved at a home in Cheatham County. And one individual there was deceased and one was still alive, but barely.
I was called by District Attorney General Kenneth Atkins to come and meet with them at a hospital in Nashville, where he stated that they had one victim who was deceased and they were expecting the other not to make it.
Steve Litgarn and John Cox had eaten dinner that night with their wives, Linda Litgarn and her sister, Sherry Cox.
They had gone to a movie that afternoon, is what she told us originally, and then they were going to have dinner at their house, and that took, I don't know, sometime after 5 o'clock in the afternoon that they met there.
They had spent some time together, ate dinner. After dinner, was involved in playing a board game, and then there were some drugs that were introduced. Supposedly, Linda Litgarn and her husband, and John, had taken the drugs. Sherry did not, because at the time she was pregnant.
Linda claimed that although she had also taken the Quaaludes, a party drug popular in the 1970s, she had felt ill and thrown up. By the time authorities arrived at the home, Linda's husband, Steve Litgarn, was already dead.
Steve Lithgarn appeared to be deceased, and there was a John Cox who was very ill at the time. Well, he was suffering quite a bit, he appeared to be, and then he became unconscious.
Linda's brother-in-law, John, remained in a coma until his death, 3 days later. By then, authorities had already realized that the cause of death was murder.
I normally go to all the autopsies. In this case, I was in the middle of processing the crime scene because it went on into the next day. And the medical examiner advises that the victim, Mr. Litgarn, did die as a result of cyanide poisoning. So that turned another direction because that tells me, more intentional. This is going to be an intentional homicide more than likely. This particular medical examiner had the ability to smell the scent of cyanide in a body. Not everybody can recognize the scent from what I've later found out, but there was a real strong almond smell. So once he smelled it, he knew, and he had some other cases in the past, so he knew quite definitively that it was going to be cyanide.
Only 40% of people can detect the smell of cyanide. Once exposed, symptoms of cyanide poisoning appear within minutes.
In some cases, you'll see individuals that will become dizzy, for instance. There's even other cases where individuals become giddy, almost as if they're exposed to laughing gas, uncontrollable laughter, and eventually it'll wind up in a seizure. Your lungs become weighted down, if you will, because fluid begins to build up in the lungs. Your ability to process oxygen, to breathe, it's difficult to exhalate and inhalate. It's a horrific way to die.
What early on happened at the scene, after interviewing the EMS personnel and everyone else, there were some inconsistencies that popped up real early. The first thing I wanted to find out is who are these people and what's their background and why would anyone want these two gentlemen dead?
John Cox and his wife Sherry were young, seemingly happily married and expecting a child.
These were a young couple with their first baby on the way, and he had a very easygoing personality just from learning about him through his other family members, his sisters, and how he was truly loved by the family, and just a great guy, hardworking guy who unfortunately became the victim of her cruelty. Steve and Linda had not been married that long. As I got more involved in the investigation, we found that it was a strained marriage. Her sister was having a child. She was unable to get pregnant. She had complained to not only her sister, but other friends about the issues they were having, problems they were having, and the fact that she really didn't love Steve, didn't care for him, and it got worse as the years went by.
Linda was a former nurse for the US Army, and at the time of the murders, helped her husband run a jewelry store in Ashland City, financed by Linda's stepfather.
Agent Breedlove is a very astute, good TBI agent. He knew from the circumstances that they used cyanide in the jewelry business to clean jewelry. So we began looking at it from that standpoint, that possibly the poison came from their jewelry store.
And as we went on, we found that the cyanide was a kind of a constant denominator between Linda, her husband, Steve, and their business that they were involved in. So not anybody just can go to the store and pick up a dose of cyanide, so that in itself was very unique. But we also had to look at other factors. What's the motive? Why would she want them dead?
Shortly before their deaths, Linda had taken out insurance policies. on both Steve Litgarn and John Cox.
They were both, at that time, $150,000 apiece. And Sherry, the sister, had no knowledge of her sister purchasing a life insurance policy for her husband, which is a little bizarre. And also, the following Monday morning, Linda was contacting the insurance company 10 minutes before they even opened their office.
Linda's account of the event and her behavior during the investigation continued to raise red flags.
Once we got into it, more things started coming, and then it turned into a true web of deceit on the part of Linda Litgarn. Linda had advised first responders that she had taken 2 capsules and then threw them up. Later on, when she got into the ambulance, as she was questioned a second time, then she said she took 4 capsules. Toxicology indicated there was no cyanide in her system, nor were there any pills found where she said she threw them up.
As well as the inconsistencies in her story, her behavior caught the attention of the investigators.
She didn't seem very upset about it, to be honest with you. She would only get upset when she was around her sister. And so that was strange how she was reacting to it.
She was very calm and not emotional at all, as opposed to her sister, who was very emotional in a state of shock. It was hard for her to even talk to me. We had Sherry, who, in my eyes, was a true victim. I mean, she showed all the indications of one who's lost a loved one that she adored. And then we had Linda, who really didn't show much emotion.
The investigation found cyanide powder in several rooms of the Litgarns' home, and receipts showed that Linda had previously bought empty pill capsules.
Her inconsistencies were the main evidence we had, and the fact that she had access to cyanide poisoning, and the fact that over a period of time they weren't getting along. And I think she was looking to get out of the marriage, and that's what appeared to us.
The thing about people who try to cover up, who lie, many times they don't remember their lies, and so they will say something later on down the road that's inconsistent with what they earlier said. And this is what was happening in the process of this investigation.
On October 23rd, 1986, Linda reportedly opened a letter addressed to her husband. In it, a man named Darryl mentioned supplying Steve Litgarn with the Quaaludes. Linda stated that Darryl was an acquaintance of her husband's and that she had met him only once. On October 28, Linda called the Cheatham County Sheriff's Office to report that she'd been assaulted in her home.
We saw that the house appeared to have been forcibly broken into. As we made our way inside the house with our weapons drawn, we made our way down the hallway to the back bedroom, where we found Linda Litgarn. And she was on the floor on her stomach, and she had been tied. Hog-tied is what we call it, where her hands were behind her back and her ankles were tied and pulled up. And so I did ask her who did this and how did she call 911. She did state that she was able to dial 911 with her tongue, pushing the buttons, which seemed a little bizarre.
Litgarn stated that one of her attackers was the man responsible for Steve and John's deaths. Once again, her story was riddled with inconsistencies.
During the course of processing the scene, she did state that this Darryl individual came to find some audio tapes between her deceased husband and this person, and that's the reason why he was there, and that he had taken 7 cassette tapes of conversations about the manufacturing of drugs, along with a few other items.
And Darryl's name came up yet again, in unusual circumstances.
I was able later to learn that when she was in the Army, in Germany that she was also involved in an incident in which she was tied up, hogtied. She was found in the back bedroom by her then former husband, and her severed finger was laying on the kitchen counter. And she claims that this individual named Anthony Darrell, came and paid her a visit. We learned that after the fact. We also corroborated that with the sister, that she did cut her own finger off.
On October 29, 1986, Linda again contacted police to hand over a small box of powder she claimed she found in her husband's car. She later said it was found in a kitchen cupboard.
We were at the point where now we needed to ask Linda if she would polygraph, because there were some inconsistencies. So that was going to be our way in to go from interview to interrogation. Because we really didn't have, at that point, enough evidence to charge her, but we were right there on the outer edges. And so we polygraphed her. She took 2 controlled polygraph tests and was deceptive in both, and especially when asked if she was responsible for the death of her husband. She was deceptive in her answers.
By now, Sherry Cox could no longer deny that she suspected her own sister of killing her husband.
We didn't want to just come right out early on and say your sister, but she saw enough of what her sister was doing that she cooperated with us all the way through. Over the months this went, she finally came to the conclusion my sister was involved and she's responsible. And so now she was sure that she was responsible for her husband's death as well.
On February 26, 1987, Sherry Cox finds the reportedly stolen cassette tapes and a gun in Linda's house and delivers them to police.
It was at that point that my interview went from interview to interrogation. She did admit lying about some things, but she still maintained she wasn't involved in his death and all. But there was the inconsistencies were really building up, and the deception was getting more detailed on her part. I was at this point accusing her, and once I got into the accusatory stage with her, she totally shut down and went catatonic on me. She sat there and stared off into space. She had a cigarette in her hand, and she literally let the cigarette burn all the way down to nothing, but there was no response, no movement, no nothing. And so this went on for quite a while. And so she just basically shut herself off from us, and it was quite bizarre. I interviewed anybody and everybody who came in and out of her life. One of the things that was consistent with Linda Litgarn is she was deceptive. She lied to everybody.
On June 15, 1988, Linda reports being attacked at her workplace by Anthony Darrell. The description she gives of her assailant is different to the description she gave in her previous report. On June 20, Linda again contacts police to say that her attorney has received a letter. The 5-page letter is signed Melody Darrell and details Steve's homosexual relationship with Melody's husband, along with accusations of a drug manufacturing partnership.
During this investigation, the Nashville police learned that there was a co-worker who was somewhat nosy and keeping up with what Linda was doing. She was doing something secretive in the office, according to the co-worker, and she was able to uncover a couple of pages of words and different type of unique words that were used. And the words corresponded with the same words being used in this letter that was sent to the attorney. I went to the office and interviewed the employee as well, and we were able to also remove the typewriter that Linda used, and we found in the typewriter and the type ribbon was the whole complete letter that was sent purporting to be from Melody Darrell. That also kind of tightened the noose, so to speak, where we were really getting close, and we decided at that point, about 13 months later, we had enough facts together that we proceeded to the grand jury and presented all the evidence.
On the 18th of November, 1987, Linda Sue Litgarn is indicted on charges of first-degree murder of her husband, Stephen Litgarn, and her brother-in-law, John Cox. On the 9th of January 1990, she pleaded guilty to all charges.
While we were picking the jury, they approached us and wanted to enter a guilty plea. And so we agreed to accept a guilty plea, and they pled guilty on the day of the trial started. It meant a life sentence in penitentiary, which I understand from Agent Breedlove that she is still there. But that has been 30-something years ago.
Since 1990, Linda Litgarn has been serving a life sentence at Mark Luttrell Correctional Center in Memphis, Tennessee. Linda Litgarn's poisonous crime left 2 men dead and a child to grow up without a father.
She has had her child. She went through any grieving spouse would go through in losing someone like that. And they were, they were young and they were starting out, and she was so in love. There was such a true loss, emotional loss. At the end of it, she wanted her sister to pay for the crimes she committed. But it's just like yesterday that this happened, and especially to the family members. And that's the hard part, is seeing that process after all these years, that it doesn't, family members, they move on, but there's this hole, this just true hole in their part of their being, because they lost a loved one like that.
It ended his life at a fairly young age. And you know how that has to be with people that expect them to live for several years and they're taken away like that. It would be an impact on anybody that loved him.
Anybody who loses a loved one like that, the impact it has on the other family that's lasting for years never goes away, never goes away.